All right, man, I am really excited about today. I left my Bible sitting over here. I'm going to grab that. I'm really excited about today. For those maybe who haven't been around the last couple weeks, I need to get everybody caught up real quick. This is a very different message series than we normally do here. There's not kind of the fill in the blanks in your message notes like normal. My goal is not to kind of tell you what I think necessarily the Bible is saying in this series as much as maybe I do other times, although there's going to be some of that today. But the idea of this series is simply to take a story and to walk through it narratively. To take a character in the Bible and walk through that person's story narratively and kind of ask ourselves, what can we learn from this person? What do we see in this person's life? Because the reality is one of the things the Bible's the best at, but we don't always do, is the Bible is really, really great at revealing the heart and the motivations of people. And it's great at kind of like illuminating who we are because although cultures change, although context changes, all those things, people fundamentally have not really changed. And so when we look at the Bible narratively, when we really go, okay, these were human beings, like yes, different than us, but not that much different than us. These were human beings who lived and their experiences impacted them and shaped them and changed them. When we look at them that way, we can see all kinds of stuff that we may not otherwise see. And so as a result of that, what I don't want to do is just say, well, here's what the Bible says. Here's what you should learn from this particular part. Here's what you should see. Again, I'm going to do a little bit more of that today than I have the last couple weeks. It's just the nature of the message today. But more than that, what I'm hoping is that as we look at these characters narratively, you might be able to see some things in your own life, in your own story that resonate with the story that we're looking at. And in that, my hope is that God might show you some things that are very specific to you and your life and your story that maybe he wouldn't show to me. It's actually been fun. This week was the second week of, I'm doing a men's small group on Thursday mornings early. And we're doing sort of the same thing that I'm doing in this series, but we're doing it with a different character in the Bible, a guy named David. And it was cool this past week. We had some really good discussion, but one of the neat things that happened was there were a couple guys who had some insight and they saw some things in the story that I never have seen, which is really a cool thing. It's not that I missed it. It's just that like my life experience I wouldn't have seen what they saw. And that's the power of looking at the Bible, especially through a narrative lens. So on your message notes today, if you're a note taker, you'll see that there's some scriptures listed and then there's just some blanks. The idea here is just that you would be able to write down whatever it is that God shows you as we walk through the text today. Now I'm going to tell you up front, we're covering a lot of scripture today, like a ton. So once I jump into it, I'm going to walk through it fairly quickly because we need to. You want to eat lunch and so do I. And so we're gonna make that happen. Also, you might notice on the back of your message notes that there are the chapters and the verses that we're covering today are listed there on the back. If you want to dig deeper into the story yourself, that stuff is there. You can kind of use that as a reading plan this week if you'd like to dig in on your own. And then there's a place where you can write down questions, comments, confusions, concerns, different things that, if you walk through this on your own, like what is it that you see in the text? And if you're in a small group, that's a really great way, you can take those to your small group and talk to them there, and it can become a really neat thing. So that's all there for you. Now, as we start today, I'm going to open us with a word of prayer, and I'm going to do it specifically because I'm going to ask God to talk to each of us, wherever we are in our own stories. Then I'm going to give a quick recap because if you haven't been here, we're in the middle of this narrative, and then we'll jump right in, all right? So let me pray for us. Father, thank you for your love. Thank you for your grace. Thank you that you can take our stories, our lives, our experiences, and that you can use the stories of your people from generations upon generations ago to speak into our lives and into our stories in really unique and special ways. And so, Father, I pray for each person that is here today, for every story that is represented, for every life that is represented, for every experience that is represented. Father, I pray that you would speak to us where we are. I pray that you would show us what it is that we need to see today, each of us individually, that you would help us to see what we need to see today, that we might be able to find more hope and more life in you. We love you. It's in your name we pray. Amen. All right. So, quick recap. The title of the series is The Dreamer. The Dreamer is a reference to a man named Joseph. Joseph lived thousands upon thousands of years ago, and Joseph was born into a very special family. In fact, Joseph's great Joseph's great-grandfather was a man named Abraham, and God had given Abraham a special promise. He said, I'm going to bless the whole world through your family. You're going to be my special chosen people. And then that promise was passed from Abraham to his son Isaac and to his son Jacob. And then Jacob had 12 sons. Joseph was the 11th of 12. But Joseph's brothers hated him because he was his dad's favorite. And his dad made that known by giving him this special coat. And his dad would send him when his brothers were out tending the sheep and stuff. His dad would send him to check on him and bring reports back. They hated him. But more significantly, Joseph had these dreams that his brothers would bow down to him. And then he decided it'd be a good idea to tell him about it. And so they despised him. They hated Joseph. And this all kind of culminated in them deciding, hey, we're going to kill this kid. We don't want to deal with this anymore. And so at 17 years old, Joseph's brothers decided to kill him. And he was going out to check on him when they were shepherding one day, and they took him and they threw him in a well, intending to kill him. But one of the brothers stepped up and said, no, let's not kill him because we don't gain anything from that. Let's sell him to these traders that are coming by because then we'll make some money off this deal. And the other brothers went, that sounds better. So they sold their 17-year-old brother to these traders. The traders eventually ended up in Egypt and sold Joseph to a man named Potiphar, who was the captain of the guard of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Joseph eventually became an important person in Potiphar's house. He was a man of character, and he had this ability to kind of turn everything that he touched into, it was successful. He kind of just was successful in everything that he did, and he kind of kept moving up through Potiphar's household until eventually he was in charge. But then Potiphar's wife decided that she wanted Joseph for herself, and she tried to convince him to sleep with her, and he turned her down. But eventually she took his robe and said to Potiphar, look what happened. Your slave tried to come after me, but I got his robe. And Joseph was then thrown in jail for something he didn't do. Eventually, after a couple of years in jail, there were a cupbearer and a baker who had these dreams. And Joseph had done the same thing in jail that he had done inside Potiphar's house. He'd kind of risen up, and at this point he was in charge. He oversaw all the prisoners. And the one day the cupbearer and the baker both had dreams, and they were frustrated. They didn't know what they meant. And Joseph was like, well, I can help you out. God will tell me what your dreams mean. Tell me. And so they told him. And Joseph explained their dreams. And with the one, it was a really good dream. With the other, it was not so much. But with the good dream, he said, hey, when Pharaoh restores you to the place as his cupbearer, will you remember me? Because I'm in jail for something that I didn't do. Would you remember me? And the cupbearer said, yes, I will. And then the dreams happened, a reality happened just as Joseph had predicted. The cupbearer was restored to his place, but he forgot about Joseph. And that's where we ended the story last week. Now, the reason all of this matters is because at this point in Joseph's life, he has had a very, very rough run of it. He was his dad's favorite, a favored son in this favored family who was betrayed in a terrible way by his brothers. And then he was betrayed by Potiphar. And then he was eventually forgotten by the cupbearer. And he's just kind of had this, every time things are really good for Joseph, it's like his whole world comes crashing down. And so each of the last 2 weeks, we've kind of left with this really important question, which is how do you survive betrayal and injustice time and time and time again without letting it completely consume you? Now, again, the powerful thing about the Bible is that although the Bible is full of stories, and although those stories have all kinds of different things we can pull out of them, one of the powerful things is that those heart issues, how do I survive injustice and betrayal again and again and again and again? Those are issues that we all wrestle with. We've all been in places where we're like, I don't understand why this is happening to me. I didn't do anything to deserve it. Where is God? Where is God? Because it seems like God has completely forgotten about me. Now, today what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at the next part of Joseph's story. And critically today, we're going to begin to answer the question anyway, how do I survive injustice and betrayal again and again and again? As we walk through the narrative today, we're going to look at Genesis chapter 41, which is, we're going to pick up literally the next verse after we left off last week. But as we look at this today, what I want you to do is watch for patterns of behavior, patterns of thinking, patterns of speaking that Joseph has throughout this narrative. At the end, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 5 pieces of evidence that I think point to what Joseph did so that the betrayal and the injustice didn't consume him, okay? And we're going to look at some of what we looked at today, but we're also going to back up and look at some of what happened last week, because the patterns that Joseph displays are not just patterns that we see in this story, but these are patterns that he has used for many, many, many years at this point. All right, so keep an eye on that. We're going to start in Genesis chapter 41, verse 1. When 2 full years had passed, Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river there came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. And the cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the 7 sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning, his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. Then the chief cupbearer said to Pharaoh, "Oh, Pharaoh, today I'm reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once very angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now, a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream. And things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled. So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he had shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Joseph, I had a dream, and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream, that you can interpret it. I cannot do it, Joseph replied to Pharaoh. But God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. We're going to skip a few verses ahead. Pharaoh just recounts his dreams to Joseph, and we're going to pick back up in verse 25. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon. And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to all his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way." Then he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, but without your word, no one will lift a hand or foot in all Egypt." Pharaoh gave Joseph the name Zaphanath-Paneah and gave him Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, to be his wife. And Joseph went throughout the land of Egypt. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Pause real quick. That make anybody feel like they haven't really achieved much in their life? No. Joseph is 30 at this point. Now, if you remember from week 1, and I mentioned it here a few moments ago, but Joseph was 17 when his brothers sold him into slavery in Egypt. So this is important context. All that has happened to Joseph, the betrayal of his brothers, the betrayal of Potiphar, the injustice done to him by being forgotten in the dungeon, all of it, 13 years. Joseph has spent 13 years riding this wave of ups and downs, highs and lows, incredible success, devastating betrayal. Incredible success, devastating injustice. He's 13 years. That's a long time. That's a long time. And so the question that I've been asking, how do you survive injustice, betrayal, and not let it consume you? How do you survive it for 13 years? Because for us, I know at least for me, my tendency is when things don't go right, like I can accept that. I can accept that sometimes things fall apart, that sometimes things happen that shouldn't happen. I can accept that. But I just want it to be a little bit, for a little while, like a few days, a couple weeks, maybe like, okay, God, we can like a couple months here of things being tough. But what happens when it's years upon years upon years upon years? We'll pick back up. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Before the years of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph by Asenath, daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. Joseph named his firstborn Manasseh and said, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim and said, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." The 7 years of abundance in Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food. Then Pharaoh told all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph and do whatever he tells you." When the famine had spread all over the whole country, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph because the famine was severe everywhere. That's where the narrative part of our story is going to end for today. Now, Joseph, as he's ridden this wave of highs and lows for 13 years, he finds himself yet again in kind of the highest high that he could possibly be. I mean, it would have been one thing for a Hebrew slave to rise to the top of the house of the palace guard. It's a whole nother animal for this Hebrew slave to rise to second in command behind only Pharaoh in all of Egypt. At this time, Egypt was one of the great superpowers of the ancient Near East. And Joseph would have been second to Pharaoh only. That doesn't happen for a Hebrew slave, but it did for Joseph. Now, the thing is, at this point in the story, when we look at all that has happened, there are some themes that start to emerge. There are some critical patterns, I think, that start to emerge. Namely, that Joseph just has this way of kind of rising through the ranks. He has this way of kind of convincing the people around him And we don't know whether it's through his words, through his actions. It's almost certainly a combination of both. We don't exactly know what Joseph does that makes people go, I trust you, like a lot. But again, if we just take this in a narrative sense, we can make some pretty good guesses. For starters, I think it's important to understand that as people, we don't tend to give away boatloads of responsibility to people who are hung up on their past. Right? It's not typical for people who are hung up on their past to be able to have the forward-looking vision, to see what's coming, to make plans. People who tend to be hung up on their past are, by their nature, hung up on their past. People who are fixated on all the bad things that have happened don't have a tendency to show us that they can be trusted because they can't get past the other things that happened, right? Now, I'm painting with broad strokes here, but there's clearly something inside Joseph that there's clearly like a personal responsibility. There's clearly something inside of him. Now, the text keeps saying God was with him, the Lord was with him, the Lord was with him. But Joseph could have kept looking at all the bad stuff that had happened. He could have stayed fixated on, oh, my brothers abandoned me, or my brothers betrayed me, Potiphar betrayed me. If he would have done that, though, do you think that it's likely that Joseph would have kept moving forward and advancing? Probably not. Don't know that for sure, but probably not. I've not met a lot of people in my life who are hung up on all the bad things that have happened that I've gone, I think that they should probably have a ton of responsibility. I just haven't. So, most likely, Joseph was not fixated on those things from his past. And we see there's three major places. If we circle all the way back to Genesis chapter 39, verses 3 and 4, it says, when his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. Later on in the chapter, in Genesis 39, verse 23, when Joseph's in jail, the warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. And then today, Genesis 41, verse 39, then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. Again, to reiterate, you don't tend to trust people who are bitter about their past. You just don't. You tend to trust people who demonstrate an ability to move forward, an ability to adapt, an ability to adjust. Yes, the text says that God was with Joseph. I believe that is true. But I'm going to read way between the lines for a moment, and I'm going to say that I believe that one of the reasons God remained with Joseph is that Joseph didn't let what happened in the past get in the way of what God was doing in his life. I said earlier that I was going to give 5 pieces of evidence that I think show us what Joseph did that enabled him to not stay focused on the past. Well, the first was he made a decision not to stay focused on the past, I think. Now, again, this is me interpreting. This is me reading between the lines. This is me taking a narrative and saying, well, how do people behave? What do people do? People that are bitter about their past don't tend to move forward. They stay stuck. And so I believe that Joseph made a decision not to stay stuck in the past. The second major piece of evidence that I think we find are the names of Joseph's sons. We read that today in chapter 41, verses 51 and 52. I don't know if you caught this or not. It says, Joseph named his firstborn son Manasseh and said, it is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household. The second son he named Ephraim and said, it is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. A couple very important points here. Maybe the most important is that Joseph didn't ignore what happened to him. Joseph didn't just bury his head in the sand and that wasn't real. I think sometimes when we talk about moving forward, sometimes when we talk about not getting stuck on the past, what we think that looks like is just forgetting it. But that's not real, particularly when you've been abandoned and betrayed in very significant ways. Joseph named his first son Manasseh and said, I have forgotten about my father's family. There's still some stuff inside him from that, clearly. The second son, Ephraim, because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering. Joseph is acknowledging that he has suffered, and he has suffered greatly. He's not glossing past that. He names his sons things that remind him of it. And yet, even within the names, there's a looking to the future. The third piece of evidence that I think we see, we're going to jump back in the story to Genesis 39:9. When Potiphar's wife tried to get Joseph to sleep with him, you may or may not remember this from that week, but Joseph begins to say, well, Potiphar has done this, Potiphar has done this, Potiphar has done this, Potiphar has done this. He's been good to me, he's been good to me, he's been good to me. And in the context of the narrative, you would expect Joseph to say, so why would I do such a wicked thing against Potiphar? Because that's what he's been crediting Potiphar with all these great things. But what Joseph actually says as he closes the argument to Potiphar's wife in Genesis 39:9 is he says, how then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God, not against Potiphar? Now, it's clear that Joseph looks at this and says, Potiphar's been good to me, I'm not going to betray him. But Joseph still doesn't see the good things that have happened as primarily the blessing of Potiphar. He sees them as the blessing of God. And that is a significantly important difference. If Joseph had been crediting Potiphar with all the good things and seeing Potiphar as the source of the good things, then he's not going to be concerned about sinning against God. But he is, because Joseph recognizes that although Potiphar may have been the one who carried out the good things, the blessing was from the Lord, not from man. So we've got the responsibilities that were given to Joseph. We've got the names of his sons. We've got the way Joseph said, I'm not going to sin against God. But then the last two pieces of evidence I think are the most significant. The fourth is the way that Joseph consistently gave credit to God for the talents that he had and the gifts that he had. Joseph could have taken credit for these things, but he didn't. I pulled a few examples, but there's actually quite a few more in both chapters 39 and 40. In Genesis 40, verse 8, Joseph said to them, do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams. In Genesis 41:16, he says, I cannot do it, meaning I cannot interpret the dreams. Joseph replied to Pharaoh, but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires. A few verses later in 25, then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do. And then just a couple verses later, it is just as I said to Pharaoh, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. It would have been very, very easy for Joseph to say, yeah, I can do it. Yeah, I can interpret dreams, but he didn't. Joseph never one time in all of these narratives took credit for the fact that he was able to interpret dreams. Joseph recognized that it was God and God alone who gave him the ability to interpret the dreams. And that assigning of credit where credit is due is a gigantic theme throughout this entire narrative. Joseph never looked to himself or to the people around him as the source of anything that happened. He looked to God as the source. And the fifth piece of evidence, which again, I think we only find when we look at this from a narrative standpoint, is the way that it seems Joseph told this story to his children and his grandchildren. And here's what I mean by that. This story is written down in the book of Genesis. Joseph didn't write the book of Genesis. Most likely Moses did, hundreds of years after Joseph. There were no other Hebrews in Egypt observing these stories. The origin of these stories was Joseph's firsthand recollection of what happened while he was in Egypt. And you see time and time and time and time and time again, Joseph assigning credit to God, Joseph saying that God was the one that did X, Y, Z. Joseph, God, the Lord, the Lord, the Lord. Genesis 39:2, the Lord was with Joseph. Genesis 39:20. While Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. Genesis 39:23. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in everything that he did. The only way that those stories get written down that way is if Joseph himself, as he began to tell his brothers, his dad, his kids, his grandchildren, as he told these stories, the only way that gets written down is if Joseph said, the Lord was with me, 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 the Lord was with me. Joseph could have taken credit for all of it. He could have said, I crushed it. You should have seen me. You should have seen what a good job I did with everything in Potiphar's house. You should have seen what a good job. You should have seen how incredible I was at all these things. You should have seen, man, these dreams, I like dead on, perfect, nailed them. But he didn't. He said, the Lord revealed to me. The Lord, the Lord, the Lord, the Lord, the Lord. All of Joseph's successes, he could have taken credit. He took credit for none. He said, the Lord was with me. This doesn't get written down by Moses this way if Joseph doesn't start telling the stories by saying, the Lord was with me. The Lord was with me. And when we put all of this together, I think that the evidence is absolutely overwhelming that the reason that Joseph didn't let all the negative stuff that happened to him, the terrible stuff that happened to him, overtake him is because he kept his eyes fixed on something bigger than his past. He kept his eyes fixed on God. He kept his, it's like horse blinder. You know, like you guys are familiar with horse blinders, right? The reason horse blinders matter is because with horses' eyes being kind of on the side of their heads, their peripheral vision is incredible. But if something happens over on this side, they'll turn their head to look at it, and when they turn their head to look at it, they'll turn. So having blinders on horses' eyes is critically important for them to keep going in a straight line. And so it was with Joseph. It's as if Joseph had horse blinders on. He was aware, he knew what had happened. Again, we go back to the names of his sons. The guy had some pain in his life. But in the midst of all of it, instead of going, and turning and fixating on the pain, he kept his eyes fixed on God and kept going step after step after step after step after step, trusting somehow that as terrible as all these things were, they weren't the end of the story. And they weren't. At this point in Joseph's life, he's risen to a place of power that, that even in his dreams, he wouldn't have predicted. He's risen to a place of importance that he never could have imagined. And he's done it all, according to him, he's done it all by keeping his eyes fixed on the Lord. For each one of us, when we go through hard things, and please, I do not say this to minimize anyone's hard things, because there's some pain that we've been through. But for each of us, the way that we don't let that pain, abandonment, betrayal, whatever it is, the way that we don't allow it to consume us is by keeping our eyes fixed on the God in front of us, not the stuff behind us. It doesn't mean we ignore it. It doesn't mean we bury our head in the sand. It doesn't mean we just pretend it didn't happen. But it does mean that if we're walking through life like this, and then when a hard thing happens, we do this, it'll consume us. If we're walking through life and all of a sudden a hard thing happens and we do this, it'll consume us. But if we stay here, we can get through anything because the Lord is good and the Lord is faithful. And like we sang about today, his promises never fail. And he has promised that he will never leave us, that he'll never forsake us. He's promised that he won't abandon us. He's promised that he is an anchor for us. He's promised that he is a mighty fortress and a stronghold that we can run to and find safety and rest. Now, at this point in Joseph's life, everything is looking up. And there might be some of us that are sitting here thinking, well, it's awfully easy to say those kind of things about God when you're in the position Joseph is in. Yeah, he suffered, absolutely. But the dude's in a position now where he's like, how can you say anything bad about God when you're second in charge of Egypt? Then you started as a slave. That's a fair question. I'm not going to answer that today, but what I will tell you is that next week, as we continue the narrative, what we're going to find is that although Joseph stays on the mountaintop, the worst ghosts of his past circle back around. And while it is very, very easy to praise God and to keep our eyes fixed on him when we're on a mountaintop, it's a whole different thing to do it when the greatest source of pain in your life comes right back and stares you dead in the face. And so next week, what we'll do is we'll look at what Joseph does as that happens. And what we'll have to figure out is, did these patterns that Joseph put in place in his life to this point, does he maintain them? When now in a position of power, he has the ability to seek revenge on the ones who have hurt him the most. And we'll figure that out next week.